So you might have noticed this. People comment on this periodically. In the church today, for quite a while, there's more women than men. The church has well, in fact, I'll show you. Right now, there's about 60%, a little over 60% of people attending church in America are women, and 40% are men. And so, if you're ever single, looking to men, if you're ever single, looking to meet women, the church is a great place to do it. Trying to get our sons to, pick up that. But why? What's going on? So listen to this. Leon Poodles, I'm going to refer to him more later, says men are less religious than women. Such is the opinion of saints, scholars, and churchmen. Saint Teresa of Lisieux claimed that women, quote, love God in much larger numbers than men do. 20th century theologian Karl Rahner observed that women are more pious than men and that they are more frequent churchgoers than men. By the way, there's little evidence during the first millennium, the first 1,000 years of church history, there's little evidence of an imbalance between men and women in Christianity. But starting in the Middle Ages, one of the first writings is about 1200, where this is referred to. Beginning in the Middle Ages, there are more and more comments about the greater religiosity of women. So here's the thing, you guys. This is not true of other religions. Women being more involved than men is not true of the other major world religions, and was also not true of Christianity in its first 1,000 years. And in fact, I would probably also add, in other parts of the world, it's not true of Christianity, but it is true in the West since about 1000 AD. What's going on? Why is this? Trust me, people have been talking about this. People have been writing about this. People have been writing books trying to answer this question. And so this could be the topic of a whole big discussion, which we don't have time for today. You'll see why I bring it up in just a minute, but I'll say one thing. This is a book that I found helpful on this. Leon Poodles, I referenced him earlier. He says, what is the source of this antipathy between men and the church? What is the interaction of maleness or masculinity and the medieval and post-medieval Christianity that creates such a tension? Men have been told by theologians and preachers that they need to become feminine to be Christians. Now, this gets us to all kinds of discussions and debates that we could have. I mean, our country today, people are talking ad nauseum about male and female and what it means and does it even mean anything. But can we just say that there are certain characteristics that we associate with masculinity, strength, right? As opposed to, let's say, meekness or weakness or whatever. Independence, making your own way, making your way in the world would be kind of something we encourage for masculinity, and as opposed to just dependency. And also aggression, or like controlled aggression. When defending when people are being abused or whatever, to be willing to risk yourself and defend the defenseless, right? Those are some qualities of masculinity. And so these are pictures that one of them at least goes back to the Middle Ages, but depictions of Jesus is not necessarily terribly masculine. And some of these characteristics, you have strength as a masculine trait, and then sometimes in the church we just emphasize, meekness and whatever. Independence, making your own way, is one thing that would be a masculine trait. But then on the other hand, in Christianity, we emphasize don't go your own way. Become dependent on God. Aggression, of course, terrible. We're going to turn the other cheek, right? So what does this do? What does this mean to be a manly person, and also be a Christian? Do I need to become less of a man to be more of a Christian? And that's been the confusion to some degree in Western churches. In 1970, a guy named Richard Hooker was concerned about this. Again, people have been concerned about this for a long time, and he was concerned about the feminized pictures of Jesus, and so he created this painting. I bet you've probably seen this before. This is still used quite a lot. Pictures of Jesus. He looks very European, first of all, which is kind of weird. He's not Palestinian or a Jew. He's more like a, I don't know, Swedish or whatever. But what's weird about this, this painting has gotten the name Surfer Jesus. He just kind of looks more like a surfer dude than anything. And in fact, it's crazy. If you look at it, it even looks like he has tan lines from wearing his sunglasses. Um, and there's more like this. Trust me, there's more like this. Um, so where? Oh, did I drop that slide? I had another slide. Okay, well, there's ones that are even more crazy of depicting Jesus as like jacked. You know, there's a picture of Jesus at the Last Supper, just super jacked dude, like making sure he gets his protein before the Last Supper. Just craziness. So what? So anyway, what we're talking about today is really an example of what you might think of as a very masculine kind of thing, where Jesus is not afraid to offend people. He's not afraid to mess up the status quo. He sees an injustice and he's going to rectify it. So really, if you again, there's so much more we could talk about with this, and if you want to do more, we can talk about it later. Let me know. But really, Christianity, you have Jesus supplying us with the ultimate manifestation of what masculinity is. It's controlled strength. It's the willingness to confront, combined by emotional control and not being offended or triggered, but doing what is needing to be done. And this is an example of this. In fact, Poodles makes this point. There are at least 5 explicit mentions and at least 25 references in the Gospels to anger, frustration, or indignation of Jesus. In fact, the Gospels testify more to anger in Jesus' life than any other emotion. Not that he was an angry guy, but just that was an emotion that came out in certain places where he was seeing injustice and needing to confront it. And again, this is the classic instance where Jesus comes in and sees what's going on in the temple and wreaks havoc, basically, right? Now, this account is recorded. It's one of the few things that's recorded in all 4 of the Gospels. All 4 of the Gospels, these writers remember this, and they talk about it. And like so often happens when different people talk about something, they remember certain parts of it. And so it's not like there's sometimes confusion about this when people try to evaluate the what would you say, the accuracy of the Bible, where they'll say, okay, one gospel writer remembers these things and another gospel writer tells the same story but has other details. Does that mean it's not a reliable thing? But it's more like this is how it works, that when we go through different things, different people go through the same thing and they remember things in a little bit of a different way. It's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's just that they experience things. And also, these writers are each writing the gospel, telling the gospel story in different ways to a different audience, and therefore kind of trying to focus on different things. So the point I'm going to make here is that this gospel, and if you have your bulletin there, there's a place you can write notes if you want. So the first thing we want to say is that John, when he tells this story, he focuses on what happened here He focuses on what's going on here a little differently than the other gospel writers. Which, by the way, if you're familiar with the Gospels, you know that's kind of typical. John was written later than the other Gospels, and he, in some ways, had the more time to reflect, and he tells a more thematic story, and so this is how it happens. Now, the quick background: this is during the Passover feast. During the Passover feast, the idea was all Jews should come to Jerusalem, or everywhere in the world. Okay? So for these 3 days, masses and masses of people come to Jerusalem. And part of what they're called to do is to come to the temple, to worship at the temple, and to offer sacrifices at the temple. Well, if you're traveling 200 miles by foot, you're probably not going to bring some dead animals in your back pocket to bring to the temple. You're going to have to get them somewhere. So people had this idea, let's at the temple during this Passover time, let's set up some booths and sell stuff that the people who are coming for this festival will need. So that's what is going on. You have the temple, masses of people there, and then all of these booths and things being sold that the people will use for their worship. That's the setting. Luke emphasizes a certain aspect of this. He says, this is in Luke 19, when Jesus entered the temple, he began to drive out those who were selling. He said, "It's written, my house will be a house of prayer, and you've made it into a den of robbers." And so some people will read that, and what they focus on is that Jesus is mad because they're charging too much, right? It's sort of like the focus is that they're taking advantage of people by selling stuff, and they're charging too high a price. They're turning it into a den of robbers. But there's actually more going on than that. John, when he recalls this, he says, remembers Jesus saying, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." And it's not so much about you're charging too much, you're not robbing people, but you're making it into a market. So we're going to go on to a little bit more about what that means for what John wants us to know about Jesus. But again, first of all, he's focusing the story a little bit different. And the point that he's making is not so much about corruption. It's not that, there may have been corruption going on, and there's part of that. But what John wants to emphasize is not so much that Jesus is mad at these guys because they're corrupt. Jesus is just disrupting the whole thing. He's disrupting what's going on in this, kind of the whole thing, the whole sacrificial system. So it's about disruption. So think about how revolutionary this is. So one, he is calling them or challenging them that they've turned the temple into a market. Okay? That's sort of disruptive. That's sort of challenging to them. But now you take it to a new level, because he calls it my Father's house. You've turned my Father's house into a whatever market or whatever. So Jesus is making some claims about who he is and his authority. And in fact, so there's kind of disruption on a few levels. He's exercising authority over the whole thing. He's completely like messing up the whole sacrificial system. He's calling the temple my Father's house. And here's the thing, you guys. The Jews completely understood what was going on. They're not mad at Jesus for making, for, I don't know, throwing over a table. They're like recognizing something is going on here. He's making some statements about all this stuff that we're doing, and what they in fact, I'll go back up. They right away ask, by whose authority are you doing this? Right? If it was just some random weirdo messing up stuff, they would say, why are you doing this? But it was Jesus, again, making a ruckus of and disrupting this. So they're saying, who gives you the authority to do this? Carolyn Lewis, theologian, says this: the question the Jewish religious authorities, whom John refers to as the Jews, the question that they pose to Jesus in verse 18 shows that they perceive that Jesus' dramatic temple act is a claim for his authority to represent God. They asked Jesus to validate that authority, expecting that, like Moses and Aaron had done for the Israelites, that he would perform some signs and wonders that would authenticate him as God's representative, right? So that kind of going back to Exodus 4. And what does Jesus do? He says, you want a sign? I'm not going to perform a miracle right now, but here's the sign. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again. So that is his sign that he's going to give them. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again. And as it so often happens in the Gospel of John, they get confused by his analogy, because they think, well, you can't destroy this whole building. You can't just build it back up in 3. They're thinking about the specific temple building, but Jesus has a different thing in mind when he's talking about the temple. So the shift here is Jesus is focusing on, thinking about, talking about the temple not as a place, but as a person, as himself. So John recognized that Jesus was talking about himself. In a few days, they're going to crucify him. He's going to be killed. And in 3 days, he will be restored. He will come back to life. So, in fact, there's foreshadowing on a couple levels here. Because first of all, there's foreshadowing about Jesus' death and resurrection. You're going to destroy this temple, and then in 3 days I'll rebuild it. But he's also completely revolutionizing the whole idea of a temple. Because the temple is where people would go, because that's where the presence of God is. And what Jesus is going to do is give people the Holy Spirit where the Holy Spirit is dwelling in them. And in fact, that is actually what happens at the end of the Gospel of John, where he breathes to the disciples and says, receive the Holy Spirit. So, all right. So total disruption. And again, I'm going to guess that nothing that I've said is news to any of you. We've heard this, Jesus disrupting the sacrificial system. But again, it challenges all of us to decide about our thoughts about Jesus. So many of you know that there's a lot of, within our society, there's people who no longer go to church. And there's a certain group of people that no longer go to church because they consider themselves to be atheists. That's a pretty small group. There's a larger group of people who don't go to church, but they still consider themselves to be spiritual people, right? I'm a spiritual person. Maybe they might even say, I'm spiritual, but not religious. And what's interesting, I've been in a couple of settings where I'm spending a lot of time with people who identify themselves that way. And what I'm so struck by whenever I'm in those circles is everybody likes Jesus. They all think Jesus is amazing. So they don't go to church. I'm not sure what they think about Jesus, but they certainly think he was a good teacher and had great things to say, and they want to emulate him. But again, you remember C.S. Lewis made this point that it's not that simple. Here's what C.S. Lewis said: a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be a lunatic on a level with a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman and something worse. Because Jesus didn't just talk about loving one another and turning the other cheek. He talked about the fact that he was going to be killed and rise again in 3 days. He talked about the fact that they were in his Father's house. So, in word and deed, Jesus claimed a unique authority to reveal God to people. Jesus claimed a unique relationship to God, that God was his Father. Jesus claimed to have the authority to overhaul the entire Old Testament sacrificial system. And when challenged about this, Jesus predicted that his death and resurrection would be the sign of his authority. Do we believe him? That's our question today. Do we believe him?